It's This Week in Utah Politics for Friday, August 2nd, 2024. The Utah Supreme Court allows a challenge to the state's near-total abortion ban to go forward. In response, Republicans call for a special session to pass new abortion restrictions in the state. Want to see Donald Trump when he comes to Utah later this month? You'll need to pony up at least $10,000. A Utah congressional primary goes to a recount, but it's a long shot whether the results will change. The International Olympic Committee could pull the plug on the 2034 Salt Lake City Games unless Congress backs off investigating a doping scandal. Plus, we spend far too much time getting mad about the Paris 2024 Olympic opening ceremonies. Hi there, I'm Brian Schott, political correspondent for the Salt Lake Tribune. Welcome to This Week in Utah Politics. In just a minute, we'll talk with my colleague Emily Anderson Stern about the top stories from the past week. And then later in the podcast, we'll chat with Mike Madrid. He was the political director for the California Republican Party and one of the original founders of the Lincoln Project. He has a tremendous new book. It's titled The Latino Century: How America's Largest Minority is Transforming Democracy. Madrid will explain how Latinos are changing America's political landscape and how Republicans and Democrats are dropping the ball when it comes to bringing this fast-growing electorate into their coalitions. I'm really excited for you to hear this conversation. It's great. Before we get down to that, though, don't forget to subscribe to the program. We're on all of the major platforms now, including Apple Podcasts, which is great. So it's very easy to subscribe and just get every episode in your inbox every single week. Also, if you have a minute, please consider leaving us a rating and review. That just really helps new people find the show, which will help us grow our audience. You can also leave us a voicemail if you have a question or comment about the show. That number is 385-236-3205. Once again, 385-236-3205. And just leave your message there. It could be a question, a comment, a guest you'd like to see. I might even use it on an upcoming episode of the show. Now that that's all out of the way, it's time to get down to business and the news of the week. It's This Week in Utah Politics, and it's a very, very busy day. We are recording this on Thursday afternoon, August 1st. And joining me is the Tribune's Emily Anderson Stern. She's been extremely busy because we've had a very big ruling today from the Utah Supreme Court in which they ruled that a challenge to the state's near total ban on abortion can go forward from Planned Parenthood. Emily, can you walk us through that decision just a little bit and explain what it means?
So all of this goes back to 2020 when the Utah legislature passed a near total ban on abortion. And of course, back then, the 1973 ruling Roe v. Wade was still in place, which protected Americans' constitutional right. It essentially outlined that Americans have a constitutional right to access abortion. But, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned that in 2022 in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization. And essentially, they gave state legislatures the ability to make these laws around abortion, to ban abortion. And Utah's trigger ban immediately went into effect. Planned Parenthood Association of Utah that same day filed a lawsuit. And a few days later, a judge blocked the law. And so for just over 2 years now, that law has been blocked, and a different trigger law, which has an 18-week gestational ban, has been in place. So abortion is legal here up to 18 weeks. The legislature
and you mentioned the trigger ban, which is what this law is commonly known as, right. And it is an almost total ban on abortion, with very few exceptions. And if you were and like you mentioned, it was passed in 2020. With the anticipation that Roe v. Wade might be overturned, but they had no guarantees. And then when Roe v. Wade was overturned in 2022 with the Dobbs decision, this went into effect. Now, this ruling does not mean that abortion rights are preserved in the state. It just means that this challenge to the almost complete ban that lawmakers had passed 4 years ago that challenge can go forward in a lower court.
Yeah, and really just the only thing that the state was appealing to the Supreme Court was to lift that block from back in 2022 on the law so that the near total ban could go into effect. And so that's all that the Utah Supreme Court ruled on. So the block on the law will stay in place. Abortion remains legal up to 18 weeks. And it'll go back to a lower court to determine whether the 2020 law is constitutional under Utah's constitution, not the U.S. Constitution that the Dobbs decision addressed, but Utah's constitution.
And as I saw, Utah legislative leaders were not happy about this ruling. They once again slammed the Utah Supreme Court for making this decision. It echoed a lot of what they said a couple of weeks ago when the Utah Supreme Court said that the legislature overstepped their constitutional authority when they altered the Prop 4, which created the Independent Redistricting Commission. And you were at a news conference earlier this morning with Senator Dan McKay, who was the author of the original trigger ban, and now he wants a special session to lower the existing state law from 18 weeks down to 6 weeks for the time frame that a woman could seek an abortion.
Right. And, he's asked the governor and legislative leadership to call a special session. I reached out to the governor's spokesperson to ask about that. And she essentially didn't give me an answer. She said that, the governor said that he's looking at all of the options. But his statement was very much, he said that he was disappointed in the ruling when he put out a statement and that his office is looking at ways that it can, essentially restrict abortion here.
Well, we do have interim meetings coming up this month in just a couple of weeks, and that's usually when we do see these special sessions. And we already had one back in June. They were off interim meetings this month in July. So if it were to happen, you would expect it to, if it happened quickly, it will be in August. If not, it may be September or October before the interim is finished. But so you have to wonder just how outraged they are and how quickly they want to move to make this change. But it's something that we're going to have to keep our eye on going forward. What was your take or how did you perceive the reaction from legislative leaders? Because they once again really were unhappy with the state Supreme Court.
It seems to have fueled their fury. They were pretty mad about the redistricting decision, as you mentioned. And again, they're mad about this. And essentially, their statements touch on the power of the judiciary versus the power of the legislative branch. And lawmakers feel that the Utah Supreme Court is infringing on the legislative branch's authority. And, in a way that the Utah legislature in recent years has passed a number of bills to increase its authority. And they don't seem to be too happy that some of that could be curtailed. In fact, even in this case, the Utah legislature tried to change court rules to essentially target this injunction specifically. They targeted the language that a district court judge used to issue this block on the law.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting part of this, that they tried to use their authority as lawmakers to head off any challenge in the courts, which is supposed to be a co-equal branch of government. But as you've said, the legislature has been giving themselves more power over the past few years. And most notably, that really started in the wake of the COVID pandemic, when you saw that in order to reinstate a mask mandate or to reinstate school closures because of a pandemic, it not only required the governor to do it, but it also required sign-off by either the Senate president or the Speaker of the House of Representatives. And that just continued this trend. That was the start of this trend where lawmakers, it wouldn't be out of bounds to call it an increasingly imperial legislature, where they see themselves as the ultimate power when it comes to setting policy for the state, and they need to be involved in every part of it. So we'll watch that going forward. Earlier this week, you also reported that Donald Trump, he's coming to Utah for a fundraiser in August, and if you want to go see him, you're gonna have to pony up. It's a lot of money, anywhere from $10,000 to $500,000 to go see him at this fundraiser in Park City.
Yeah, for context, when President Joe Biden was here last August, it was a smaller gathering than what Trump's going to have, but he held a fundraiser too, and the price of that for admission was $3,300 to $100,000. So Trump is asking for a lot more money to see him here, which I guess isn't surprising. There are a lot more Trump supporters than Biden supporters in Utah. It's a red state, but it is quite a significant price. And I was Googling other things that cost $10,000. It's the same price as having to franchise at Chick-fil-A.
And the chicken at Chick-fil-A is probably going to be a lot better than the one that they have at this fundraiser, the rubber chicken circuit. And also, one of the reasons why the price tag is so high is there's a lot of organizations that are going to get their beaks wet from this. That money's not just going to the Trump campaign. Some of it will go to his campaign. Some of it will go to the Republican National Committee. There are state parties involved. There are other organizations supporting his reelection bid.
Right. And some of it goes, there's the $3,300 max that'll go directly to his campaign. Then there's the $3,300 that'll go to a recount account, which the FEC allows candidates to have. Mm-hmm. But I mean, it shows that the Trump campaign is preparing to possibly challenge results if he loses in November. And there will also be money going to another PAC, the Save America Political Action Committee, which Trump has repeatedly used to pay his legal bills as he faces criminal charges.
And those costs have been going down in recent months, and he's been able to put more money towards his campaign. You mentioned recount. We've got one ongoing here. We are recording this on Thursday, so we don't know the results for certain, but it is a recount in the Congressional District 2 Republican primary between incumbent Celeste Malloy and challenger Colby Jenkins. Malloy won by 214 votes. Jenkins asked for a recount, but his efforts to get ballots that were excluded because they had the wrong postmark, those have been thrown out of court. So when they're doing a recount, they're essentially just recounting all the ballots that have already been counted. And it's very rare for recounts to change the outcome of races, especially when you're looking at 214 ballots. If it was maybe 10, there's a chance, but it's very rare that we see this.
Yeah, and I mean, we've heard from Representative Malloy's campaign that they're pretty confident that this won't change the results.
Yeah, and there's not much more to say about that. It's just that it is a recount. It does it does bring some extra drama to the race. There may be a few legal challenges by Jenkins going forward, but essentially he lost by a handful of votes, and you might see the margin tighten a little bit. You might see more votes go in her column, but essentially this race is over and done with unless something absolutely catastrophic happens or and changes the result. Last thing, and this was a really great story from Julie Jagg, who's over in Paris for the Olympics, and her own Robert Gerke, in that the International Olympic Committee is pressuring the U.S. Olympic Committee, and they're lightly threatening to pull the plug on the 2034 Winter Olympics here in Salt Lake City unless Congress backs down from an investigation into the World Anti-Doping Agency. They're looking into a doping scandal that happened in China. And there's actually a provision in the contract that says the IOC can revoke the games for here in Salt Lake City unless organizers do not respect WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency's authority when it comes to governing these things. And if they have to repeal a law that allows U.S. law enforcement to prosecute foreign citizens who are involved in doping schemes if it impacts U.S. athletes or sponsorships. Now, that's kind of outrageous, but it just shows this tension between international sport and the way sports are administered here in the United States. They've got 10 years to work this out, and that's a long time, but it's also not a long time. But it just shows you sort of the push and pull between international sport and sport in the United States.
Yeah, and I think, although Utah was really, Salt Lake City was not really the only option when this was finalized last month, I think it raises questions as to whether or not the IOC is using Utah's Olympic bid to leverage Congress to go a different direction with that. And, it's interesting. It'll be interesting to see over time how that develops and how Utah leaders react.
Yeah, and if you're wondering why they aren't doing anything about this with the 2028 Los Angeles Olympics, well, that planning is already underway. We're just sort of not on the event horizon of actually hosting the games yet, so there's a lot of time for politicking and this kind of pressure. And the last thing, and we wasted far too much time on this in the media and in online discourse, and it just once again shows the push and pull between values elsewhere and values in the United States. Utah political leaders got really, really worked up about a part of the opening ceremonies in Paris that they say depicted the Last Supper, and it had drag queens and transgender people, but the person who put it together said his inspiration was not the Last Supper. And there's just been a lot of online discourse. You saw Governor Cox complaining about it. You saw legislative leaders, and they are vowing that you won't see anything like that in the opening ceremonies when they come to Utah in 2034. And my response to that would be, I would hope not, because that's Paris.
Well, and also, whether it was the Last Supper or not, I think what that shows is also how Utah's Republican leaders view the LGBTQ plus community. And there will be a lot of questions around that as we await the Olympics coming to Utah 10 years from now. Especially, as Utah has on the books right now, a bathroom ban for transgender people in government-owned buildings. And a lot of the buildings that will be built for the Olympics will likely be government-owned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and, the thing that I found amazing about this whole controversy was that they got really, people got really upset about that part of the opening ceremonies. And I did not hear a peep about the menage a trois that was actually referenced in the opening ceremonies. My jaw hit the floor at that point. And then I turn on Twitter, which was, a dumb thing for me to do in the first place. And I always regret doing it. And everybody's mad about this and not the sexual promiscuity that was not even hinted at in the opening ceremonies. And I was really surprised that that tableau along the Seine was what people focused on rather than, something that would really poke its eye in the morals of some of the more puritanical aspects of American culture.
Well, that probably goes to show that a lot of the people that were being really loud about it online probably didn't even watch the opening ceremonies. They were just piling on based on what they saw other people say.
Ding, 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 ding. But I'm guessing a lot of people didn't see it because you see it in clips, you see it online, and then it's filtered through your own bubble. But that's we've wasted more time on this podcast talking about it than we should have, and it was a thing for several days. So I'm glad that we've mostly moved on beyond that, and we can start focusing on other issues. That was Tribune political reporter Emily Anderson Stern joining us on the podcast. You can find her on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it. Her handle is Emily R.E. Anderson. That's Emily R.E. Anderson. And you can find her there. And you can also read her stories on sltrib.com. Joining me today on This Week in Utah Politics is Mike Madrid. He's the former political director for the California Republican Party. Had that job for two decades or so. He was one of the original founders of the Lincoln Project, and he is the author of a fantastic new book called the Latino Century. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But Mike, it's so great to have you on the show.
Brian, appreciate you making the time. Looking forward to the conversation.
Well, I think I'm actually looking forward to it more than you are because I really appreciate your perspective. We'll get to the book in a second, but I'm really curious, as someone who has been a political observer working on campaigns, mostly Republican campaigns most of your life, what do you see as the state of play in the presidential race now that Joe Biden stepped down? I mean, it seems like it was a lifetime ago, but Kamala Harris has been a candidate for what? Like 10 days now. So I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on the state of play of the race and how much things have changed.
Well, look, it's been an extraordinary reset, and it's obviously historic because of the late nature of it. Even though we're less than 100 days out, no nominee in modern history has ever been selected this late in the process. But we've tipped clearly into kind of the cultural phenomenon space here. I don't think that they expected, nor did most of the punditry expect. I certainly did not expect that it would sort of catch fire this way. I absolutely expected a short honeymoon bump for her, but it feels in many ways like this trajectory is not only going to continue, but the contours of the race may have in fact changed. And that is very... this is the first time I'm saying that kind of publicly. I was somebody who was saying the data would suggest that Biden is more competitive than we think he is, and I don't think a change is appropriate. But this is a completely different race. It's we're not following the same trajectory anymore, and I've got to acknowledge that. It's you know I was wrong at how fundamentally things I think could change. This week will be important in terms of whether or not she can continue not just the momentum, but this prosecutor versus perpetrator narrative. And we'll see what happens with the next round of data as she comes under what will probably be some withering attacks. But it's a competitive race. There's no question about it.
I think you're right in saying that Biden would have been competitive against Trump. I mean, he was up until that disastrous debate performance. But it seems like the X factor, the thing that nobody saw, was just the overwhelming enthusiasm we're seeing from the Democratic base, from even in independents, the so-called double haters, the people who did not want either Biden or Trump and said, we want to see someone else. Well, someone else is in the race. And now it feels like enthusiasm is just off the charts.
That's exactly right. That's a really good way to put it. The first thing that we were looking for is how fast the Democratic base would consolidate, not just from the leadership, which it did quickly, very quickly, not just from the delegates, which it did equally as quickly, but from the voters. And that response, I think, was surprising to a lot of us. That would suggest it would take a couple of weeks to actually come together. It not only didn't take a couple of weeks, it really didn't take more than a couple of days. And so I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that Democrats are energized to finally be on the offense and arguing for somebody, when ever since the Trump era, they've really felt like they've been on defense. Joe Biden was a defensive pick. Let's remember that. He was not the top choice of most primary voters. In fact, he was behind in every category except for one, which was Democratic voters believed he stood the best chance at beating Trump, which was the priority. And I think now what they're realizing is if we just coalesce and unify, we can actually march down the field offensively. We don't have to be in this defensive posture. And I think that's a lot of the excitement and oxygen that has flooded into the room that's fueling this movement. And I think it was a movement. I think she actually has possibly a couple more points to go on the upward side of things to get this race into a place that will start to pull, from a polling perspective, look like the last couple of months of the 2020 race.
You talked about going on offense, and we're recording this on Wednesday. I think we saw that in the Tuesday evening rally that Harris had in Atlanta, because she came out and in a tight 20-minute speech went right at Trump on a number of issues. She went right at him in immigration, which is really a perceived weakness of hers, and she went right at him in this. And it really feels like the Republican Party was not prepared for a possible entry into the race by Harris, and they're really caught flat-footed by her going on offense against him. Am I reading that right?
Well, you're reading it exactly correctly, but let me explore this a little bit because you're tapping into something that is really quite extraordinary. This is the first time in 3 decades I've ever seen where Democrats are trying to lead the charge on border security. And not only is she leaning into the offensive play of that, but they're articulating policy specifics. Nobody has ever seen Democrats begin a rally at an enthusiastic speech beginning with border security issues. And not only did she do that, she launched an ad about an hour before the rally, again, offensively owning policy positions. This is exactly what I prescribe in the book. This is precisely what I say Democrats needed to do. They've needed to decouple border security from immigration reform. They've been locked in a 10-year bad strategy of demanding both, knowing full well they were never going to get it. They're owning this now, and they're going to put the Republicans not only on the defensive, but they're going to redefine, I think, the possibility is to redefine the party on this issue, which has been hurting them since the end of the Obama administration. And just as a political observer, I think it's fascinating to watch because, again, as somebody who's very involved with the Latino community and Latino issues, the immigration issue, I have never seen Democrats behave this way. This is where the voters are at. This is increasingly where Latino voters are at. And something internally in this campaign has recognized that where they were going was problematic, and where they're headed is actually towards a future where they're not locked in this immigration headlock that they put themselves into. So it's pretty extraordinary to watch.
And let's use that as a great transition. The book is called The Latino Century: How America's Largest Minority is Transforming Democracy. This is a really great book, Mike. Kudos to you on this. And it just really lays out not the moment that we're in. And I've heard you say that you really rushed to get this thing out ahead of this election. But it addresses sort of the moment we're in, but it really lays out where we are heading as we have the largest minority, and America is on the precipice of becoming a minority majority country. So this is a vital read, and I would really recommend that everyone take a look at it. Give us the thesis of why you wrote this. I mean, just give us the TLDR of what you were hoping to accomplish.
Well, I definitely wanted to look. I've been working on Latino politics, mainly in GOP politics, but I've worked for Democrats too in very big races. Worked obviously on the Lincoln Project, so I've seen both parties, how they approach Latinos, what they're doing right, what they're doing wrong. But I felt compelled after 30 years to write the book now because I saw us heading down to this bad place where we could have seen and may see Trump win an election with a record share of Latino votes. If that were to happen, that would essentially be a failure of not just the Democratic Party, but it would be a failure of pro-democracy activists to understand the moment. And the moment that we're in, to answer your question specifically, is we are in a moment where we are going to redefine the concept of what a quote-unquote minority voter is. Latino voters, as you correctly pointed out, just surpassed the African-American vote in 2020 as the largest minority voting bloc in the country. And the numbers are going to start growing at an exponential pace. And at the same time, we're seeing more and more shift to the right, again, in a very non-traditional minority voting sense. A lot of people are kind of like, how can non-white voters vote for the Republican Party? And what I wanted to do was demographically and from an evidence-based perspective, answer that question. And what it really comes down to, Brian, is the fastest growing share of the Latino vote is third and now an identifiable fourth generation of Latino voters. These are overwhelmingly English dominant or English exclusive speakers. They don't have that personal relationship with the immigrant experience. These are rapidly moving away from a racial minority voter to an economic pocketbook voter. And these are people who are overwhelmingly employed in blue-collar working-class industries that are feeling the impact of some of the negative impacts of inflation, high interest rates, and a struggling economy at that end of the spectrum. And we're seeing them vote accordingly.
And One of the things that really struck me when I was reading this book is just the failure in the way that both parties are messaging to this growing population. And you point out a lot of it is cultural, and you have people who don't understand what the cultural piece of that is. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great point, and it's a huge point. And what I want people to understand is that I don't call this a racial realignment like a lot of kind of people are covering this. Reporters are saying there's this racial realignment happening in the country. To me, it's more of the emergence of a new vote. Almost 40% of Latino voters are under the age of 30. Like, that's an extraordinarily large number of young people. And they're just not, they don't have we have the weakest partisan anchors of any racial or ethnic group. These are not diehard Democrats. They're not diehard Republicans. They're basically saying a pox on both of your houses. None of this stuff is working. And I'll kind of choose the lesser of two evils. And sometimes that can be a more populist candidate like a Donald Trump, which makes sense because he's anti-institutional, at least in his rhetoric. He's anti-everything. He's anti-this, he's anti-that. And a lot of these folks are saying, I get it. I don't understand the policy specifics, but don't care to because I don't believe you all anyway. And so I'm willing to go and cast my lot with these folks. But the cultural components that you're mentioning, there is a blue-collar working class culture in this country that we don't recognize enough. And the culture loosely defined is basically, look, I'm not trying to be a billionaire or a millionaire. I'm trying to support a family, love to take a vacation, buy a home, and maybe save enough to kind of allow my kids to go to college and be comfortable. And if I play by the rules, I'll do the 9 to 5. I'll do that. And I'm not trying to do anything other than just be a good person and live a good life. What Bill Clinton used to say, playing by the rules, right? And getting ahead, not making $1 million a year, but just saving enough to be comfortable and not having to do anything other than live. That's essentially blue collar culture and values. Play by the rules. You get to do a little bit better, leave the country a little bit better, hand it off to the next generation. That's admirable. But both parties, again, are speaking to the Latino community as though it's an aggrieved racial minority. And that's not where Latinos are at. It's understandable in many ways because the whole black-white paradigm, the first chapter of my book is, Beyond Black and White, has always constructed this model of tension between whites and non-whites. And we're not seeing that racial tension to the same degree that we have in the past. And so it's confounding a lot of politicians and both parties by saying, well, if it's not about aggrieved racial issues, if it's not about immigration, what is it about? How do we convey these economic issues, these security issues in a way that is culturally sensitive, that is not like the way we've been talking about race for 250 years in this country?
And you also point out another part in your book, and this gets back to the economic and the populism part of it, is that the working class in America is rapidly transforming. It's no longer majority white. You are seeing the working class becoming much more brown, much more black. And those working class issues, that working class is going to have different priorities than what we've seen in the past. And, whoever figures out how to address those issues first is going to be sitting pretty well electorally, right?
Yeah, that'll become whichever party figures out how to win the votes, the hearts, the minds, and the votes of a multi-ethnic working class in this country will be the dominant party for the next generation. And for the moment, Republicans are making inroads, as I like to say, despite their best efforts, not because of them. Okay? And what I mean by that is there are tectonic demographic shifts happening economically that allow for this economic populism. 1 in 5 Hispanic men work in the residential construction space or in a related field. 1 in 5. And that's extraordinary at a time when interest rates have tripled and inflation has eaten 20% of the currency's value since Donald Trump was president. Like, it's quantifiable that these people economically were better off under Donald Trump, at least up until COVID, right? And that is a reminder that will come into play as it should during this campaign. But for a long time, there was a good run going on for this level in the economy that doesn't feel the S&P 500 setting records, that doesn't feel the economic data coming out of Wall Street. And so there's this tension between democratic messaging and where working class people are at. And I think this illustrates the fact that Democrats, as much as it's hard for them to hear, are not the party of the working class the way that their parents and their grandparents believed the party to be. I'm from a lower middle class Latino working class Democratic family, Catholic, the whole 9 yards. I'm a stereotypical Latino kid who grew up in the 80s. I know that if I was at the same dining room table today as a teenage kid, my parents would not be having the same party discussion and characterize the party the same way. And that's a conversation that's happening at a lot of Latino households. And so Democrats have trouble with the working class part of that equation. Republicans have trouble with the multi-ethnic part of that equation. And both of those struggles are very real. They're more than semantic. They're part of the cultural, ideological makeup of both parties. And as Democrats consolidate college-educated white voters at a historically fast pace, Republicans are consolidating non-college educated voters at an equally historically fast pace. The fact of the matter is the fastest growing segment of the non-college educated workforce is Latinos.
Your book, I think, should be required reading for political people here in Utah, because it's easy to write off the state. Oh, it's Utah, it's Republican, it's predominantly white, but there is change on the horizon here. I mean, you look at Luz Escamilla, who's the minority leader in the Senate, Representative Angela Romero. She is the minority leader in the House. They're both Latino. Utah has a very aging population. We're becoming much more multicultural. 23.5% of our population is made up of racial and ethnic minorities, and just over 15% of that, of the entire population, is Hispanic or Latino. So this is going to become a salient issue in local politics here in the state as that transformation, I guess, accelerates, because this change is coming.
Not only, that's exactly right. And then again, look, as somebody who's, in my early 50s now, for so long, this was a California, Texas, Arizona phenomenon. Florida was sort of the weird outlier, still is, but, now I'm getting calls from Tennessee and Montana, and you look at Utah, right? This is happening everywhere. This is why the book is called The Latino Century, is this change is happening in every state, in every neighborhood in the entire country. But you brought up one specific data point that I really want to drive home, because Utah is, I think, the most fascinating on this front. The minority leaders in both houses are women, and Hispanic women. And as I argue in the book, and there's a lot of really fascinating data on this, Hispanic women is much more common to be in leadership than not in our culture. And so the Latinization of America will in many ways be the feminization of America, because if you look at California, we have more Hispanic women in our legislature than Hispanic men. And even in red states like Texas or Florida, they're almost at parity. In New Jersey, it's significantly more women than men. In Utah, you've got, your minority party is led by Hispanic women. This is common. What we're seeing is Latinos have not just the largest gender gap in our voting, but we elect women at a rate far greater, far faster than any other race or ethnic group in the country. And so in many ways, again, I point out in the book, Latinas have achieved what white women have not been able to achieve since suffrage, which is parity in representation, because it's so natural, it's so common for us to have women in leadership roles. That's going to profoundly change not just the Latino community, but our sense of American identity and the issues that we focus on and concentrate in the approach within which we engage public policy issues.
There's a couple of other things that you point out in the book that I found absolutely fascinating. The fact that you cannot paint the Latino population in America with a broad brush, because there are, in Miami, it used to be thought of as predominantly Cuban. That's not the case anymore. You are seeing Latino people moving to the United States, coming to the United States from all over Central and South America. And they all, it's hard to communicate to each one of those because of the different parts of of their culture. I mean, and that's probably a good thing for you because you are someone who works on political communications. But I mean, that's going to be very hard for policy makers to try and address the interests, the priorities of these different populations, because you can't just say, oh, this is a policy that's going to appeal to Hispanics, because then you have to say, well, which ones, right?
Right. Yeah, look, that's a great observation. And I think one of the fascinating things that's happening as we do transform into a really, truly pluralistic American society for the first time, as you mentioned earlier, look, in 8 short years, America will be a non-white majority country. We will be a minority majority country in 8 years. Like, that's in our lifetimes. It's coming, right? And that's part of why I wanted to write this, to kind of be as a precursor of what works and what doesn't in some of the regions of this great country. Look, but what happens is, with all of these differences, and the country of origin differences, generational differences, language differences, all of these differences, what I think we need to recognize is or need to be focused on is, what are the through lines? What are the commonalities here? And the ones that I've identified, which I think are the most important, is focusing largely on the fact that this is largely a working class. This is the emergent segment of the working class at a time when we are witnessing the largest economic divides between the rich and the poor since the Gilded Age, and probably even greater than that. And that tension is very real. You can't have a society where there are fewer and fewer white people with more and more money, and more black and brown people with less and less money. Like that story has never ended well in human history. We're setting ourselves up for that. We just got to be careful. Like, there's got to be some sort of understanding that regardless of the cause, if you're on the right, you have an idea, on the left, you have an idea, both of them equally, or I should say equally valid, but they're valid. Let's have the conversation. We do know that this doesn't end well unless we rectify that. So how do we go about doing that? And the question is really, I think what you're really getting at, and I think it's exactly right, is this fundamentally a public policy area that needs to be addressed through a race and class lens, or an economic and pocketbook lens? And increasingly what we're realizing is, because of these non-white voter shifts to the right, remember, it's most pronounced with Latinos, but it's happening with African-American men too, and immigrant dense communities all over the country. There's this rightward shift. That tells us that even in this racially charged climate, which we are absolutely in, the economic concerns are predominant. That's how strong the economic need is to get out of the situation that they're in, or to find some sort of solution. So we've got to understand that addressing that, in all likelihood, ameliorates a lot of the other social tension. And whether it's a lot or a little bit, it's certainly something that goes along with making a better society and a more just society anyway. So focusing on class issues and speaking to these voters in as much of a class-oriented way as a racial and ethnic way is central to having a more cohesive society and frankly, keeping democracy going.
And I'm going to wrap up with this. I could talk to you about this for hours because this is so fascinating. But I've heard you say that another challenge for people, for those in the political class, for policymakers, is the way that this Latino population consumes information is much more different than what, we are used to.
Yeah.
Right now, you talk about what happens on cable TV, which drives so much of the conversation, but those shows have less than 1 million viewers in a country of 330 million people.
Correct.
They do not even reach 1% of the population, but it's so important, or at least drives the conversation. But you have, especially younger Latinos, they are just not plugged into that at all. They are consuming information in different ways. And I think it was Rick Wilson who said to you, whoever figures that out is going to make a lot of money on how to message and where to find these consumers. But that's also going to change my business as well.
Yes. Right. And the business you're in actually is probably at the forefront of trying to discern exactly how to engage not just these voters, but all voters, and where everybody's starting to increasingly live. Look, and you're right on the whole broader picture here. The thing to keep in mind is this is such a decidedly younger generation. Again, 38%, almost 40% of voters, Latino voters, are under the age of 30. Like, this is extraordinarily young, but it's starting to compound now. So let me give you a couple of data points that I think will help kind of put all this in perspective. 71% of all U.S. population growth is Hispanic, but it's overwhelmingly U.S. born. And not just U.S. born, but the fastest growing segments are the third and now fourth generation. Like, you can't build a wall to stop this. You needed to build that wall in the 80s and the 90s. It's way too late now. Okay, guys? So the idea of who Latinos are is stereotypically stuck in the 80s and 90s. So when I say U.S. Hispanic growth is 71%, people are like, well, that's immigration. It's not only not immigration, it's the grandchildren of immigrants that are growing the fastest. This is an English-dominant group. Only 17% of Hispanics want to get their information in Spanish. Less than 20%, okay? And most of these voters are mobile and online and communicating that way. They're not watching cable TV. They're not subscribing to newspapers. They're not consuming news in the traditional fashion that you and I have been accustomed to. They are getting their information largely on YouTube, WhatsApp channels, and online. And until that is the primary means of political communications, none of this stuff is going to actually be terribly meaningful.
Well, the book is tremendous. It is The Latino Century, How America's Largest Minority is Transforming Democracy. I'm going to hold it up again. Go buy this thing. It is a great read. Mike Madrid, thank you so much for your time, my friend. When are you coming out here?
I'm hoping to get out there in the next 5 or 6 weeks, actually. When I do, I'd love to kind of sit down and maybe we do this again. My hope is to kind of meet with the minority leaders and some of the Latino activists in Utah, because Utah is a really, like, as you pointed out, there's so much more to say about Utah and how fast it's transforming that I really kind of want to make a bigger deal out of it than in most other states that I'm going to be going to. But I will let you know first the exact dates of when I'll be out there, Brian.
Oh, I was going to say I don't need to know first because I think there's people more important than me to talk to, but I would look forward to and I would relish the opportunity to sit down and chat about this with you more. That's Mike Madrid. Go in and buy the book. Mike, thanks again for your time.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
Once again, that was Mike Madrid, and his book is The Latino Century, How America's Largest Minority is Transforming Democracy. Pick up a copy. You will not be disappointed. Let's wrap up this episode with this. Last week, Republican Speaker of the House Mike Johnson and his leadership team asked their members of the House Republican caucus to stop calling Vice President Kamala Harris a DEI hire when commenting on her presidential campaign. Instead, they've asked their caucus to focus on her policy, but Utah Representative Burgess Owens did not get that memo. Here he was on Monday commenting about Harris's campaign with Fox Business's Stuart Varney.
You look at Vice President Harris, if she was a white person, she would not be sitting in the place she's sitting in right now. She's Black, she's a woman, it has DEI to the core, and they need to own up with it, and we're looking for merit. At the end of the day, it's all about merit, and competency is more important than age. So we're gonna see that, and I think American people are gonna wake up to it for sure.
Before becoming vice president, Harris spent 4 years in the U.S. Senate and 6 years as California Attorney General. Owens is in his second term in Congress. He was part of the Oakland Raiders team that won the Super Bowl in 1980, and before he was elected, court records show that Owens filed for bankruptcy protection 5 times. He recently launched the Merit Caucus in Congress to focus on merit-based policies in public schools. Now let's take a second to check in on Senator Mike Lee, who had a very busy week on social media. In the last 7 days, Lee posted on Twitter or X nearly 700 times by my count. That's nearly 97 times per day. His biggest day was on Monday. He posted more than 220 times, mostly complaining about what he saw as the mocking of Christianity during the opening ceremonies of the 2024 Paris Olympic Games. Thank you so much for listening to this edition of This Week in Utah Politics. If you haven't yet, smash that like and subscribe button. Also, remember to leave us a rating and review. It really helps new people find the show. This Week in Utah Politics is written and produced by me, Brian Schott, in cooperation with the Salt Lake Tribune. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back next week.